Believe it or not, Chief Injustice John Roberts of our not-so-Supreme Court actually had the audacity to claim that we're all wrong to think that the justices are nothing more than glorified partisan hacks, and according to him, their decisions are actually totally impartial, and it just seems like they're biased to us because we don't understand how the court functions. I shit you not. He actually made this claim with a straight face. NBC News reports, speaking at a conference for lawyers and judges in Hershey, Roberts said the Supreme Court is required to make decisions that are not popular and bemoaned that there is not a better understanding among the public of how the court operates. Quote, I think at a very basic level, people think we're making policy decisions, because you are, that we're saying we think this is what things should be as opposed to this is what the law provides, Roberts said. I think they view us as truly political actors. We do, which I don't think is an accurate understanding of what we do. I would say that's the main difficulty. We're not simply part of the political process, and there's a reason for that, and I'm not sure people grasp that as much as is appropriate, Roberts said. One of the things we have to do is issue decisions that are unpopular, he said. Those rulings, he added, are based on our best effort to figure out what the Constitution means and how it applies. Sure, John, and I'm 7 feet tall, and I have an uncle who works for Nintendo, and he's actually letting me playtest the Nintendo Switch 3 before anyone else. In fact, I've got it right here under my desk. You want to see it? Listen, obviously, that's horseshit. It is complete and utter horseshit. Not to mention, it's insulting because he really thinks that we're stupid when he's a simpleton if he's actually naive enough to think that anyone would buy that load of bullshit. And he has it backwards. We do know how the court operates, which is why we see through their partisan bullshit. They're not even pretending to be objective anymore. They take political positions and then they post hoc justify them with flimsy constitutional arguments that they pull out of their assholes, sometimes even contradicting the precedent that they set themselves. And that's if we even get an explanation at all, because this court is notorious for shadow dockets where they do shit without even explaining their reasoning. And he's saying this in the same week, mind you, that Injustice Gorsuch did a media tour on hyper-partisan media to promote his shitty new kids book. He went on Megyn Kelly, and he also went on Fox News because he's a Republican, and Republicans go on Fox News like the partisan actors that they are. And not to mention, last week, Injustice Clarence Thomas actually made a partisan political attack against his political opponents, chastising progressives for apparently trying to, quote, replace the basic premises of the Declaration of Independence and hence our form of government. And he said this shit about his political opponents after the court that he's a part of dismantled our democracy bit by bit. His own pig-faced wife colluded with insurrectionists to overthrow the government, but we're the ones who are trying to replace our form of government. Fuck you. But that's not all, because they just did one of the most brazenly partisan things that they have ever done just within the last week. In fact, this week. So after they gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to bring back the Jim Crow status quo, they went out of their way to make sure that Republicans could capitalize on that decision before this year's midterm elections. And their behavior was so brazenly partisan that their own colleague called them out for it. Liz Dye of Public Notice explains, on Monday, the conservative justices broke the court's own rules to ensure that their partisan allies could redraw black representatives out of Congress immediately. Under Supreme Court Rule 45.3, the clerk waits 32 days before certifying a judgment and sending it back down to the lower court. That waiting period gives the losing party time to petition for rehearing, although it can be shortened or extended at the discretion of the justices. But the Louisiana primary was set to take place on May 16th, and waiting 32 days for the judgment would make it much more difficult to unwind the state's electoral maps. And so on Monday, the court's conservatives announced that they were waiving the 32-day requirement on the theory that while the appellants oppose it, they have not expressed any intent to ask this court to reconsider its judgment. The order itself was just one paragraph, but it was accompanied by an exceedingly vituperative concurrence and dissent, noting that the court had only diverged from the 32-day default twice in the past 25 years. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson hammered her conservative colleagues for, quote, acting as proxies for their favored political parties. Not content to have decided the law, it now takes steps to influence its implementation, she fumed. The court's decision to buck buck our usual practice under Rule 45.3 and issue the judgment forthwhile is tantamount to an approval of Louisiana's rush to pause the ongoing election in order to pass a new map. Justice Alito, joined by Justices Thomas and Gorsuch, howled at the baseless and insulting suggestion that they acted out of partisan motivation, calling it a groundless and utterly irresponsible charge. They are so shameless. So they keep doing explicitly partisan things, and then they complain every time somebody calls them out for doing explicitly partisan things. But if you don't want to be viewed as partisan hacks, you have to stop being partisan hacks, but they can't help themselves. So people are accurately describing them as the hacks that they are. And at this point, it almost feels like an insult to the law to even refer to them as justices, because they're politicians for all intents and purposes. And the lifetime appointments, in theory, are supposed to insulate them from political pressure that other politicians face that could otherwise influence them to make decisions based on elections and public demands. But if they're just going to be de facto politicians anyway, we should at least have the opportunity to vote these fuckers out, especially if they're going to act like fucking clowns and make a complete mockery of our legal system. But I mean, I don't even know why they're bothering to pretend to be judges at this point. They should just take off those black dresses and put on attire that's more appropriate for them. Maybe some fucking big shoes and a bright red nose like the clowns that they are, because I honestly think that that would be more suitable for them at this point. But putting that aside, I do want to go back to the NBC News article, because Roberts is also trying to insinuate that it's inappropriate for us to criticize justices because, you know, given all of the threats judges have faced due to the political climate cultivated by the president that this court emboldened, mind you. Nonetheless, NBC News continues, at a time of rising security threats against judges, Roberts repeated his concern that criticism of the judiciary should be limited to the substance of decisions and not the judges as individuals. Quote, as soon as that happens, that's not appropriate, and it can lead to very serious problems, he said. Right. So I guess we're not supposed to talk about how Injustice Alito literally flew the appeal to heaven flag of the January 6th insurrectionists who want a Christian nationalist form of government. I guess we're not supposed to talk about how billionaire Harlan Crow is Clarence Thomas's sugar daddy and showers him with gifts and luxury vacations. We're not supposed to talk about these things, even though there is a legitimate concern that these things are affecting the decisions of these corrupt justices. We're not supposed to criticize the justices as individuals, even though they're corrupt and immoral, because that'd be inappropriate. So we should only evaluate their decisions in a vacuum and pretend like they weren't made by corrupt opportunists with personal motivations. I guess that he's expecting us to be a little bit more impartial in our reading of their shitty decisions and separate our bias against the justices who are destroying our country from their half-baked decisions, which is ironic. How about this, Roberts? Why don't you show us some impartiality first? You're the justice, after all, aren't you? Once you stop being hostile to the people, maybe the people won't judge you as harshly. But I want to be clear. What he's saying here is alarming because it gives us some insight into something Roberts could theoretically do to stop us from criticizing justices. Now, the First Amendment is set in stone. He can't change that. He knows this. Well, I hope that he knows that. These days, I'm not so sure. My point is that we have a First Amendment that gives us the right to criticize public officials and say that the Supreme Court is nothing more than a bunch of partisan hacks. And the government can never punish us for criticizing public officials so long as those criticisms don't cross the line and, become threats. But what if the government didn't punish us directly for criticizing officials? What if the public officials who work for government, who represent us, that we're criticizing, have the ability to more easily punish us themselves so they can kind of circumvent the First Amendment? See, that's another thing that we apparently have to be concerned about because, as the New Republic reports, a top Trump donor is trying to get the Supreme Court to overturn a landmark decision from 1964 called the New York Times v. Sullivan, which, quote, raised the standards required for a plaintiff to win a defamation lawsuit against a media organization. Now, this was a key protection for journalists because it established a really high standard for defamation, which required plaintiffs to prove actual malice or a reckless disregard for the truth to win. And so Sullivan is important because it made it so that way public officials couldn't sue media companies out of existence if their reporters published things about them that they didn't like. Now, it hasn't stopped wealthy people from suing journalists and content creators for criticizing them, even though they know that they're not going to win those lawsuits. Ethan Klein, for example, is suing Noah Samsen because Noah Samsen published a video calling him a genocide supporter. Matt Taibbi lost a defamation lawsuit to Owen Higgins, a journalist who wrote a book calling Matt Taibbi basically a billionaire bootlicker. And even though I'm sure that it was costly for Owen to defend himself in court against the claim of defamation in the first place, it would have been much, much more costly if he lost that defamation suit. We all know that Trump and his cronies sue media outlets all the time for criticizing them, but it's very hard to prove actual malice or a reckless disregard for the truth. Regardless, it's still harmful to public discourse that so many elites are using their wealth to try to silence people who criticize them with these frivolous-ass defamation lawsuits. But if Sullivan were to get overturned, those frivolous defamation lawsuits could become non-frivolous defamation lawsuits, meaning that the bar for what public officials could sue over would be lowered. So to go back to Roberts whining about the criticism that the court is receiving, you can see now why he might be inclined to want to strike down Sullivan, because if it's easier to sue journalists, commentators, and even shitposters on social media for calling him a partisan hack, then less people are going to be inclined to call him a partisan hack. And it wouldn't just benefit him, it would benefit all politicians, especially politicians in his party. If this were to pass, it could have a chilling effect on free speech across the entire country. Nobody would want to criticize public officials if, the threshold for defamation was lower, because regular people can't defend themselves against these defamation lawsuits. Sure, there are slap protections in a lot of states, but nonetheless, overall, in states where there's no slap protections, basically, elites would be insulated from criticism from the public because there'd be this threat of a defamation suit against anybody who dared to speak out against them. And though the Supreme Court hasn't yet agreed to take on a case that would threaten the Sullivan precedent, there are already cases moving through the system that could make their way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And now that billionaire donors are saying, hey, take up these cases and get rid of Sullivan, I think that we need to be aware of the fact that it is a growing possibility, because as much as they'd like us to think that they're not partisan hacks, the Supreme Court justices are indeed partisan hacks. I mean, they're not robots. They're human beings just as capable of petty emotions as us peasants are. So my concern is that the more that the public sours on the Supreme Court, the more likely they are to start really chipping away at the First Amendment, with the Sullivan case being the first domino to fall potentially. Because, if they've already undermined so many core tenets of our democratic system, it's not unreasonable to think that they're going to go the whole way and finish the job that they started. And you have to understand that public perception is crucial to the Supreme Court. That's why they care so much. Their legitimacy is important because there's no enforcement mechanism for any of their rulings. So we can technically just choose to ignore the court, and there's nothing that they can do about it. Us believing in them is what gives them their power, so they really, really need us to believe in them, otherwise they have no power. And if they can chill speech to better control the public's perception of them so that way they can maintain power, I wouldn't put it past them to do it. But unfortunately for them, if they want to put the final nail in the coffin of our Constitution, they've got to act quickly, because both Alito and Thomas are very old. Alito and Thomas are 76 and 77 years old, respectively, and there's speculation about the White House doing everything that they possibly can to pressure them into retirement while Republicans still have control over the Senate. Because if they selfishly pull a Ruth Bader Ginsburg and die while they're in office, then that could flip the majority to liberals, assuming that they both die when a Democrat is in control of the White House and Democrats are in control of the Senate. And right now, it does seem like they're stubbornly refusing to resign. But ironically, as somebody pointed out in the SCOTUS subreddit, according to its own rulings, the president could order a hit on Alito and Thomas, and it'd be perfectly legal, which is, of course, a reference to them giving presidents near absolute immunity. And it just really goes to show you how much damage this court has caused, because that's technically true. I mean, it hasn't been tested yet, but all Trump has to do is say that the crime that he committed, or any crime that he commits as president, was done in his official capacity as president, and that would be good enough. Now, I don't think that Trump is going to do that, but the fact that he legally could, it speaks to how badly this court has fucked up our country. They helped usher in the era of authoritarianism, and on top of that, they opened the floodgates to money in politics. They gave billionaires the keys to our democracy, and they took away civil rights for black voters and Latino voters and women with Roe v. Wade, and these were rights that took centuries to secure. They also gutted what little power the federal government had to protect the planet, and they've truly fucked the country beyond repair. And after all that they've done, John Roberts has the nerve to whine about their poor public perception as if we'd all feel sorry for them, that their fifis are hurt. Shut the fuck up, John. They did this to themselves, and they should be happy that poor public perception is all that they have to worry about, given how destructive they've truly been. I mean, if there was any justice in the world, they would be impeached and prosecuted for corruption, but that's not going to happen because we no longer have a democracy, thanks to them. But they expect us to still have respect for them after they've destroyed the country, and I just find that so laughable. It doesn't work that way. Of course, people are going to hate you because they're not going to be very inclined to, lick the boot that's stepping on their fucking face, unless they're Republicans. They love doing that. But, not to kink shame, the court lost their legitimacy because they're illegitimate, full stop. And I literally have more respect for a fucking wet fart than any of these corrupt cretins. So, cope harder, Jonathan, because you reap what you sow.